There is a difference between leaving a room and leaving a person. When you leave a room, you can come back any time. The door stays open. The space waits. But when you leave a person, especially in front of 200 strangers and a camera that never blinks, something closes that is not so easy to reopen. On a Wednesday afternoon in May 2025, during a taping of Family Feud that was supposed to be fun and lighthearted and forgettable, a man named Gerald Tate stood at the family podium, looked at his wife of 19 years and walked away from her. He did not storm off. He did not shout. He simply turned around and left, like a man stepping out of a life he no longer wanted to be inside. And his wife, a woman named Pearl, was left standing alone on a game show stage with the lights still on, and the cameras still rolling and 200 people watching her try to figure out what had just happened to her marriage. Steve Harvey saw the whole thing, and the way he reacted, what he said, what he did, and the choice he made in that moment became one of the most powerful things ever broadcast on American television. If you believe that no one should ever be left standing alone, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Because what Pearl did after her husband walked out that door will remind you what real strength looks like. The Tate family from Montgomery, Alabama had been chosen for Family Feud through the show's standard application process. Their audition tape was warm and genuine, a 4-minute video filmed in their living room where the whole family laughed through an improvised round of the game using questions Pearl had written on index cards. The producers noted in their casting report that the family had natural chemistry and strong screen presence. There were 5 of them. Gerald Tate, 52, a fleet manager at a regional trucking company. His wife, Pearl, 48, a night shift emergency room technician at Baptist Medical Center South in Montgomery. Their son, Darius, 25, an electrician's apprentice. Their daughter, Keisha, 21, a junior at Alabama State University studying elementary education. And Pearl's aunt, Miss Francine, 69, a retired beautician who had raised Pearl from the age of 11 and who still cut hair in her kitchen on Saturday mornings for anyone in the neighborhood who needed a trim and a conversation. Pearl Tate was the kind of woman that emergency rooms are built around. Not the doctors, not the administrators, the techs. The ones who move through the chaos with a speed and a steadiness that keeps everything from falling apart while the people in charge make the decisions. Pearl had been doing that job for 22 years. She worked the overnight shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 3 nights a week and every other weekend. She had chosen nights because the pay differential helped cover the bills, and because the night shift was where the real emergencies came. The car accidents, the heart attacks, the gunshot wounds, the overdoses, the children who came in at 2 in the morning with fevers so high their parents were shaking. Pearl was the first face those patients saw when they came through the doors. She was the one who took their vitals, steadied their breathing, held the hand of the woman who had just been told her husband did not survive the surgery. She did this 3 or 4 times a week, year after year, and then she drove home at 7:15 in the morning, made breakfast for whoever was in the house, and went to sleep for 5 hours before getting up to do it all again. Pearl had been raised by her Aunt Francine after her mother passed away from complications related to lupus. Pearl was 11. Her father, a long-haul truck driver, could not manage a child and the road at the same time, so Francine stepped in without being asked. Francine had never married and had no children of her own, but she raised Pearl with the kind of focused, uncompromising love that some people spend their whole lives searching for. She taught Pearl to cook. She taught her to sew. She taught her to manage money, to speak clearly, to stand up straight, and to never, under any circumstances, beg a man for the attention she deserved. "If you have to ask someone to love you," Francine would say, straightening Pearl's collar before school, "they're not the one doing the loving. You are." It was the kind of advice that sounded simple but required a lifetime to understand. Pearl met Gerald when she was 28 and he was 32. He was a driver at the trucking company then, not yet management, and he came into the ER one night with a dislocated shoulder from loading freight incorrectly. Pearl treated him. He asked for her number. She said no. He came back the next week with a pulled muscle that Pearl suspected was at least partially invented. She gave him her number that time because she told Francine later, "Any man who's willing to fake an injury to see me again is either crazy or committed, and either way I want to find out which one." They married a year later. The early years were solid. Gerald was a good man in the ways that mattered at the beginning. He was present. He was reliable. He showed up when he said he would. He was not romantic in any showy way, but he was consistent, and Pearl had learned from watching Francine that consistency was worth more than flowers. The erosion happened so slowly that Pearl could not point to when it started. It was not one moment. It was 1,000 small ones. Gerald got promoted to fleet manager. The promotion came with longer hours, more stress, and a growing preoccupation with work that gradually consumed the space in his life where Pearl used to be. He stopped asking about her shifts. He stopped waiting up for her on the nights she worked. He stopped noticing when she was tired, when she was sad, when she came home after a particularly devastating night and sat in the car in the driveway for 10 minutes before coming inside because she needed to put her face back together before anyone saw her. Gerald was not cruel. He was absent. And absence, Pearl had learned, could be its own kind of cruelty, the kind that did not leave marks but hollowed you out just the same. By the time the Family Feud taping arrived, Pearl and Gerald had been married for 19 years and had been strangers for roughly 4 of them. They shared a mortgage, a car insurance policy, and 2 children they both loved fiercely. What they did not share anymore was a conversation that went deeper than logistics. Who was picking up Keisha from campus this weekend? Whether the utility bill had been paid. What to have for dinner. Their marriage had become an operating system, efficient, functional, and completely devoid of warmth. Darius, their son, had inherited his mother's perceptiveness. He noticed the distance between his parents and dealt with it by staying close to Pearl, calling her after every shift, asking how the night had gone, listening to the stories she told about the patients and the chaos and the small victories that made the job bearable. He never said anything to his father about it. He just quietly filled the space that Gerald had vacated. Keisha, the younger one, dealt with it differently. She was an optimist by nature, always believing that things would get better, always looking for signs that her parents' marriage was turning a corner. The Family Feud application had been her idea. She thought it would be a bonding experience, a chance for the whole family to laugh together and remember what they looked like when they were happy. Pearl had agreed because she could not say no to Keisha's hope. Gerald had agreed because saying no would have required an explanation he was not prepared to give. Miss Francine had agreed to be the 5th member for one reason. She wanted to watch Gerald. She had been watching him for years, the way a woman watches a storm that has not arrived yet but is visible on the horizon. She loved Gerald, or she had loved the man Gerald used to be. She was not sure those were the same person anymore. On the morning of the taping, Francine pulled Pearl aside in the hotel hallway and said, "Baby girl, whatever happens on that stage today, you remember who you are. You are Pearl Tate, and you have survived things that would break most people in half. A game show cannot touch you." Pearl had smiled and squeezed her aunt's hand and said, "I know, Auntie." But Francine had seen something in Pearl's eyes that morning that worried her. Not weakness, exhaustion. The deep bone-level exhaustion of a woman who had been holding everything together for too long and was running out of reasons to keep gripping. The Tate family was matched against the Kowalski family from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Steve Harvey opened the show with his characteristic energy, and the audience responded with warmth and enthusiasm. During the introductions, Steve reached Pearl and she said, "I'm Pearl. I'm an ER tech on the night shift. If I seem calm, it's because nothing on this stage is scarier than what I see at 3 in the morning." The audience laughed appreciatively. Steve pointed at her and said, "I believe every word of that." When Steve reached Gerald, the introduction was brief. "Gerald, fleet manager." Steve waited for more. There was nothing more. He moved on. The first round played out normally. The Tates won, with Pearl and the children contributing the strongest answers. Gerald gave one answer that barely made the board and returned to the podium without engaging with the family's celebration. He clapped once mechanically, the way someone claps at a work event they did not want to attend. Miss Francine, standing at the far end of the family podium, watched him the way she watched everything, quietly and with complete clarity. The second round introduced friction. The question was, name something a wife does that her husband doesn't notice. It was a loaded question for any couple, but for Pearl and Gerald it was a live wire. Keisha stepped up first and said, "Keeps the house running." Correct, number 3 on the board. Darius said, "Worries about the family." Correct, number 4. Then Pearl stepped up. She looked at the board, then at Steve, and said, "Stays awake waiting for him to ask how she's doing." The audience went quiet. It was not a survey answer. It was a window into a life. Steve looked at the board. Answer waits up for him was there. Number 2 answer, close enough. 34 points. The audience clapped, but the applause carried an undertone of recognition. Several women in the audience nodded. They knew that answer. They had lived that answer. Gerald stood at the family podium. His jaw tightened. He stared straight ahead, not at Pearl, not at the board, not at anything specific. He looked like a man who had just heard a door close somewhere inside himself. The round continued. More answers. More points. The Tates won the round, but the energy had shifted. The game show atmosphere had thinned, and beneath it was something heavier and more real. The third round was the one that changed everything. The question was devastating in its simplicity. Name something a wife is tired of. The Tate family was playing the round. Answers came from the children and from Francine, being the one who plans everything, repeating herself, doing it all alone. Each answer landed on the board. Each one drew applause from an audience that was beginning to understand they were watching something more than a game. Then it was Pearl's turn at the podium. The board had 2 answers remaining. Pearl placed her hands on the surface. She did not look at the board. She looked directly at Steve Harvey, and in her eyes was something that Steve later described as the loneliest honesty I have ever seen on that stage. Pearl said, being the only one trying. The studio went silent the way a room goes silent when someone says something that is so true it takes the air out of the space. Steve turned to the board. Number 1 answer, 47 points. The highest single answer of the entire episode. The audience erupted. Women stood up. Several of them were crying before they were fully on their feet. The applause was not celebration. It was solidarity. It was the sound of 200 people recognizing a truth they had either lived or witnessed and deciding collectively that it deserved to be honored. Pearl stepped back from the podium. She did not look at Gerald. She did not need to. She had said what she had spent 4 years not saying, and she had said it in front of the world, and there was nothing left to direct at the man standing 8 feet away from her because the words had not been for him. They had been for her. The first honest thing she had allowed herself to say out loud in years. Gerald did not speak. He stood at the family podium, motionless for what felt like a very long time. Darius looked at his father and then at his mother. Keisha's optimism had left her face entirely, replaced by the expression of a young woman watching a truth she had always suspected become real. Miss Francine's hand moved slowly to Pearl's back, and then Gerald moved. He did not turn to Pearl. He did not turn to his children. He turned toward the edge of the stage, took 3 steps, stopped, and said, without looking at anyone, "I'm done." 2 words, flat, final. He continued walking. He passed the cameras. He passed the production assistants. He walked through the curtain and he was gone. The studio was paralyzed. The audience sat in a silence so complete that the hum of the overhead lights was audible. Darius took 2 steps toward the curtain, then stopped, his body caught between going after his father and staying with his mother. Keisha's hand had gone to her mouth. Her eyes were filling. Miss Francine had not moved. She stood with her hand on Pearl's back, steady as a wall. And Pearl stood in the middle of the Family Feud stage, surrounded by lights and cameras and 200 strangers, and she was alone. Not alone in the way that a person is alone in an empty room. Alone in the way that a person is alone when the one who promised to stand beside them chooses, publicly and finally, not to. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was level. Her eyes were dry. She was looking at the curtain, not with shock, not with anger, but with the devastating calm of a woman who had already grieved this moment 100 times in private and was now watching it happen in real life. She had been the only one trying for 4 years. Now she was the only one standing. And somehow, impossibly, she was still standing. Steve Harvey stood in the center of the stage. He did not move for several seconds. The production team later said that they had been ready to cut to commercial, but Steve had subtly signaled them to keep rolling. He knew that what was happening on that stage was not something to cut away from. It was something to stand inside of. Steve walked to Pearl. He did not rush. Moved with the deliberate care of a man approaching someone who might shatter, and he stopped about 2 feet from her. He did not take her hands. He did not touch her. He just stood there, close enough that his presence was a physical thing, and he said, "Pearl, look at me." She looked at him. Her eyes were clear and dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible in every muscle of her face. Steve said, "You are not alone on this stage. You have your son, you have your daughter, you have your aunt. You have me, and you have every single person in this audience. You are not alone." The audience's response was instantaneous. 200 people stood up at the same time, as if pulled by a single string. The applause was not loud at first. It built. It grew from a murmur to a roar, layered with shouts and cries and the sound of people clapping so hard their hands hurt. Pearl's children moved to her. Darius came from her left, wrapping his arm around her shoulder. Keisha came from her right, pressing her face against her mother's arm. Miss Francine stepped forward and stood directly in front of Pearl, face to face, and took both of her niece's hands. "Pearl Evangeline Tate," Miss Francine said, loud enough for the first 3 rows and every microphone to hear. "You stand up straight. You hear me? You have been standing since you were 11 years old, and you do not sit down now. Not for him, not for anybody." Pearl's composure cracked, not fully. But the first tear fell, then the second. She wiped them quickly, the way she wiped everything, efficiently, without wanting anyone to see. But the audience saw, and they responded with another wave of applause that carried in it every story of every woman who had ever been left holding everything while someone walked away. Steve waited for the noise to settle. Then he spoke to the audience and the cameras. I want to say something and I want to be careful because there's a family going through something real right now, but there are things that need to be said." He paused. "A man just walked off this stage, and I'm not going to pretend to know everything that's happening in his heart or his life. People are complicated. Marriages are complicated. I've lived through enough of both to know that." Another pause. "But what I do know is this. That woman right there has been working the overnight shift in an emergency room for 22 years. She saves people's lives 3 nights a week, and then she comes home and takes care of her family. She has raised 2 incredible children. She has held her house together. And when she finally told the truth about how tired she is, the man who was supposed to be her partner walked out the door." The audience was silent now, completely silent. I have been on this stage for a long time. I have seen people win money and lose money and say funny things and say foolish things. But I have never seen someone stand the way Pearl is standing right now. That is not just strength. That is something deeper. That is a woman who has decided that even if everyone else leaves, she is going to keep standing. And I want every person watching this to understand what they're looking at. Because that kind of strength does not come from nowhere. It comes from years of practice. It comes from every night shift, every early morning, every moment of being the only one trying. And it deserves to be seen. The standing ovation was the longest the crew had recorded in the current season. It lasted over 2 minutes. People were weeping openly. A woman in the 6th row later told a reporter she had called her mother from the parking lot after the taping and said, "I just watched you, not on the stage, but I watched you." Steve turned back to Pearl. "We have a game to finish if you want to, but only if you want to. This is your decision." Pearl looked at her children. She looked at Francine. Then she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and said, "Mr. Harvey, I didn't drive 5 hours to Montgomery to go home empty-handed." The audience laughed through their tears. Steve grinned. "That's what I thought." The Tate family qualified for fast money with 4 members. Darius went first. He was shaking, visibly emotional, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through, scoring 127 points. When he came back behind the partition, he hugged his mother so hard she had to tell him to ease up. Then Pearl walked to the podium. The audience quieted immediately, not because anyone told them to, because they understood they were watching something that went beyond television. Steve began. "Name something that keeps a family together." "Showing up," Pearl said. "Name something you never get enough of." "Sleep." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. "Name something every mother carries." "Worry." "Name a place where you feel safest." "My kitchen." "Name something that is harder than people think." Pearl paused 1 second, 2, then she said with the quiet certainty of a woman speaking from the deepest well of her experience, "Staying." The board revealed the answers one by one. "Showing up for something that keeps a family together." Number 1 answer. 44 points. The audience surged. "Sleep for something you never get enough of." Number 1 answer. 37 points. Steve shook his head in disbelief. "Worry for something every mother carries." Number 1 answer. 32 points. 3 consecutive number 1 answers. The studio was electric. "My kitchen for a place where you feel safest." Number 1 answer. 26 points. 4 in a row. People were screaming now on their feet, clutching each other. Steve stood in front of the board with his hands on his head. "One more, Pearl. You said staying for something that is harder than people think." He turned to the board. He waited. The answer lit up. Number 1, 38 points. Perfect score. 177 points. Combined with Darius's 127, the Tate family had 304 points and the $20,000 prize. The studio responded with the most emotional outpouring the production team had ever witnessed. Keisha came running from behind the partition and threw herself at her mother. Darius was right behind her, his arms wrapping around both of them. Miss Francine walked over with her measured, unhurried step, placed one hand on Pearl's face, and said, "That's my girl." The audience was standing, crying, shouting Pearl's name. Strangers were hugging each other in the aisles. A cameraman later said he had to wipe his lens because his own tears had blurred the shot. Steve walked to Pearl one final time. He stood in front of her and he did something that the audience did not expect. He did not give a speech. He did not say anything profound. He simply took Pearl's hand, placed it over his heart, and said, "You feel that? That's 200 people's hearts beating for you right now. You were never alone, Pearl. You just couldn't see us yet." Pearl finally broke. The tears came fully, openly, the tears of a woman who had held herself together through 22 years of overnight shifts, 4 years of marital silence, and 1 afternoon of public abandonment, and who had finally, in the arms of her children and the gaze of a man who had chosen to see her, allowed herself to let go. Not to fall apart, to let go of the weight, to trust, for even just a moment, that someone else would help carry it. Gerald Tate did not return to the stage. He waited in the parking lot until the taping ended. When the family emerged from the building, he was standing by the car. The conversation that followed was private, held in the parking lot of a television studio while production trucks idled nearby, and the Georgia sun dropped below the tree line. Nobody in the family ever shared what was said, but Darius later told a reporter that his father had cried, and that it was only the second time in his life he had ever seen him do so. Steve Harvey spent over 30 minutes with the Tate family backstage before they left. He spoke with Pearl privately and told her that her fast money round was the most meaningful thing he had witnessed in his career. He spoke with Miss Francine and told her that her words to Pearl on stage, the ones about standing up, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Francine looked at him and said, "Mr. Harvey, I have been telling that child to stand up straight since she was 11 years old." The fact that the world needed to see it on a game show just tells you how many people aren't paying attention. Steve later called it the sharpest and truest thing anyone had ever said to him. The episode aired 5 weeks later. The response was not just viral. It was seismic. The clip of Pearl's being the only one trying answer was viewed 55 million times in the first 48 hours. The clip of Gerald's walkout was viewed 70 million times. But the clip that broke every record the show had ever set, the one that was viewed over 180 million times and was translated into 26 languages, was Pearl's Fast Money Round. 5 questions, 5 number 1 answers, 5 words that told the complete story of a woman's life: showing up, sleep, worry, my kitchen, staying. Media analysts said it was the most emotionally concentrated piece of television produced that year. Each answer was a world compressed into 2 words or less, and together they painted a portrait of motherhood, marriage, and resilience so specific and so universal that it resonated with virtually every human being who watched it. The hashtag Keep Standing trended worldwide for 9 consecutive days, the longest-running hashtag associated with any television moment that year. It was adopted by nurses, mothers, caregivers, teachers, and anyone who had ever felt like the only person holding something together. Hospitals shared the clip in break rooms. Schools posted it in faculty lounges. Churches played it during Sunday services. A fire station in Dallas printed "Keep Standing" on their engine bay wall. The phrase became a quiet national anthem for people whose strength was measured not in victories, but in endurance. Miss Francine's moment on stage went independently viral. The clip of her saying, "Pearl Evangeline Tate, you stand up straight," was viewed over 40 million times on its own. It was remixed, quoted, printed on merchandise, and adopted as a rallying cry by women's organizations across the country. Francine, who had never owned a smartphone and had no interest in acquiring one, was informed by Keisha about her internet fame. Francine's response, delivered while cutting a neighbor's hair in her kitchen, was, "If people need a 69-year-old woman with a pair of scissors to tell them to stand up straight, then I'm glad I was available." The quote was shared another 12 million times. The impact on Pearl's professional life was immediate and profound. Her hospital in Montgomery held a ceremony in her honor. Over 200 colleagues attended, along with dozens of patients and family members who had been treated by Pearl over the years. One by one, they shared stories. A paramedic described how Pearl was the calmest person in the ER during a mass casualty event and how her steadiness had saved at least 2 lives that night. A mother described how Pearl had held her hand in the waiting room at 4 in the morning while her son was in surgery, and how Pearl had stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift to make sure the boy was stable before she left. A doctor, a veteran trauma surgeon with 30 years of experience, stood up and said, "I have worked with hundreds of techs in my career. Pearl Tate is the best I have ever seen. She does not panic. She does not cut corners. She does not leave until the job is done. And she treats every patient like they are the most important person in the building. If you want to know what the backbone of American healthcare looks like, you are looking at it." Pearl sat in the front row and listened to all of it, and when it was over, she stood up and said simply, "I love my job, I love my patients, and I'm going to go take a nap now because I have a shift tonight." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Pearl and Gerald's marriage entered its most honest phase in 19 years. They began couples counseling 2 weeks after the taping. Gerald, for the first time, talked openly about the disconnection that had grown between them. He told the counselor something he had never told Pearl, that he had felt increasingly invisible at work, that younger managers were being promoted around him, that he was afraid of becoming irrelevant. The fear had turned inward, becoming a withdrawal that he did not know how to reverse. Pearl listened without interruption and then said, "Gerald, I have spent 4 years watching you disappear. You were never invisible to me. You chose to stop being visible." The counselor later described it as the most honest exchange she had facilitated in 20 years of practice. The marriage was not healed overnight. It was not a game show miracle. It was 2 people sitting in a room and deciding to start from the truth, which was the only foundation strong enough to build anything on. Steve Harvey invited Pearl back for a follow-up segment 8 months after the original episode. When Pearl walked onto the stage, the ovation was so sustained that Steve had to wait nearly 2 full minutes before he could speak. Pearl wore a deep cobalt blue dress that Keisha had helped her choose. She looked rested. She looked present. She looked like a woman who had not been sleeping 5 hours a day for the first time in a long time. During the segment, Pearl shared the developments. The hospital ceremony, the counseling with Gerald, the fact that Gerald had started coming to the hospital once a week to bring Pearl dinner during her break, something he had never done in 22 years. She talked about the thousands of messages she had received from healthcare workers who said her episode had given them permission to admit they were exhausted, that they were carrying too much, that they needed help. She read one message on air from a night shift nurse in Philadelphia named Claudette who wrote, "Pearl, I watched your clip at 3 in the morning in the break room between codes. I was about to quit. I had already written my resignation. But I watched you stand on that stage after everything and I thought, if she can keep standing, so can I. I tore up the letter. I'm still here because of you." Pearl's voice broke on the last sentence. Steve wiped his eyes. Steve revealed during the segment that Pearl's episode had inspired the show's most significant community initiative. Family Feud, in partnership with the American Hospital Association, had established the Night Shift Fund, a $5 million grant program providing wellness resources, childcare support, and mental health services specifically for overnight healthcare workers. The population that research consistently showed was most vulnerable to burnout, depression, and relationship breakdown. The fund was the largest single philanthropic initiative in Family Feud history. It was named by Pearl, who had chosen the Night Shift Fund because, as she told Steve, the people who work while the world sleeps are the ones the world forgets. This makes sure someone remembers. Pearl's children continued to carry her legacy in their own lives. Darius, inspired by the outpouring of support for his mother, enrolled in an emergency medical technician training program. He told Pearl he wanted to understand the world she had worked in for over 2 decades, so he could never take it for granted the way it had been taken for granted before. Keisha wrote her senior thesis at Alabama State on the sociological impact of invisible labor on family structures, centering her research on her mother's story and the public response to it. The thesis was published in an academic journal and was cited by researchers studying the intersection of work, gender, and emotional labor in American families. Keisha dedicated it to my mother, who taught me that standing up is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to keep going despite it. Miss Francine continued to cut hair in her kitchen on Saturday mornings. She did not change her routine, her personality, or her hairstyle in response to her internet fame. When a local news crew came to interview her about the viral clip, she sat them down at her kitchen table, served them sweet tea, and told them she had one thing to say. Every woman in this country is holding something together that nobody sees. Some of them are holding marriages, some of them are holding families, some of them are holding themselves, and the only thing most of them need is for someone to look at them and say, "I see you. Keep going." That's all I said to Pearl on that stage. And it's what I'm saying to every woman watching this right now. I see you. Keep going. The interview was viewed over 25 million times. 3 women's shelters in Alabama named their programs after Francine. She donated every appearance fee she received to Pearl's hospital. 1 year after the episode, Pearl was invited to give the keynote address at the annual conference of the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. She stood before an audience of 4,000 healthcare professionals in Chicago and spoke for 22 minutes. She did not talk about Family Feud for the first 11. She talked about the patients. The 3 in the morning heart attacks, the children with fevers, the families in waiting rooms, the smell of antiseptic and coffee and fear that defined the overnight shift. She talked about what it felt like to hold a stranger's hand while they took their last breath and then drive home in the morning light to a house where no one asked how her night was. Then she talked about the stage. "A game show asked me what I was tired of," Pearl said. "And for the first time in my life, I answered honestly. I said I was tired of being the only one trying. And you know what happened? The world heard me, not my husband, not my family, the world." Millions of strangers heard what the person closest to me had stopped listening to. She paused. I think about that a lot, not with bitterness, with wonder, because it taught me something important. It taught me that the truth does not need volume. It does not need drama. It just needs one honest moment. One moment where you stop holding it in and you let it out. And when you do, you discover that you were never as alone as you felt. You were surrounded the entire time by people who understood. They were just waiting for someone to go first. She looked out at the audience. So I went first, And I'm asking all of you, the people who work while the world sleeps, the ones who carry everything, the ones who are tired of being the only ones trying, I'm asking you to go first too. Say the thing you've been holding, to your partner, to your boss, to yourself. Say it, because the people who need to hear it are already listening. They just need you to trust them enough to speak. 4,000 nurses rose to their feet. The ovation lasted until Pearl left the stage, and it continued after she was gone, echoing through the hallways of the convention center, carried by 4,000 people who had spent their careers caring for others, and who had just for one moment been cared for by the words of a woman who knew their life from the inside. Pearl still works the night shift. She still arrives at 11 and leaves at 7. She still holds the hands of frightened patients and steadies the breathing of people in crisis. But now, when she drives home in the morning light, she does not sit in the driveway composing her face. She goes inside. Gerald is at the kitchen table. There is coffee. Sometimes there are words, and sometimes there is just the quiet company of two people learning how to share a room again after years of occupying separate corners. It is not perfect. It is not a fairy tale. It is two imperfect people deciding every morning that the other one is worth the effort. On the wall of Pearl's kitchen, next to the clock she watches during the 5 hours of sleep she gets each day, there is a framed piece of paper. It is not the Family Feud check. It is not a newspaper clipping. It is a note written in Miss Francine's careful handwriting that reads, "Stand up straight, baby girl. The whole world is watching, and they are so proud of you." Pearl sees it every morning when she makes her coffee. And every morning she stands a little straighter. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Share this with a nurse, a mother, a night shift worker, or anyone who has ever been the only one trying. Tell them you see them. Tell them to keep standing. And remind them that saying the truth out loud is never a weakness. It is the bravest thing a person can do.